So this is lecture 9, and today we are going to continue to talk about Gramsci's intellectuals. This is a continuation of the previous lecture, and today we are going to look at Gramsci's theory. In the previous class, I had mentioned Gramsci's observations, and before that I had also mentioned the terms that he uses, right? The terminology, and in particular I had spoken about two of the terms that keep recurring in all kinds of theories. In literary, or most of the literary theories, you will see a recurrence of the idea of class. So that I had explained. Plus, the other term that we spoke about is organic, and how that term is used by Gramsci. So today we are going to look at what Gramsci's theory is. I hope you remember the observations that Gramsci had made, but just in order to segue from the previous lecture to this one, I'll just mention a few points so that that transition is easier for you. So one of the key observations are that while intellectuals may like to believe that they are objective, that they are autonomous, that they are not influenced by the class to which they belong, that is not true. So that is one of the observations that Gramsci makes. And based on that observation, he says that it is possible for intellectuals to also align with other classes, right? So if you remember, I gave you two examples, well, three examples, but two categories of examples. On the one hand, there was the example of Marx and Gramsci, people who rose from the working class, and now everyone knows them. On the other hand, there was Alexis de Tocqueville, and Tocqueville was a French aristocrat, descendant of a French aristocrat to be more specific, and his family was the direct victim of the violence during the French Revolution. So he was from a very different class, and while there are differences in the ideas of Tocqueville, Marx, and much later Gramsci, but there are also inherent similarities, right? There are some similarities. So the point, and taking a cue rather from Gramsci, is that it is possible for intellectuals to associate themselves or align themselves, or maybe to identify themselves, or perhaps a fourth word, to commit themselves to other classes, right? So a lot of words, I'm using them interchangeably, and I hope you have identified at least one of those words that I have used, right, for purposes of understanding these ideas better. Now, with those observations in mind, Gramsci theorizes intellectuals, and in today's lesson specifically we are going to look into what those theorizations are. So what is Gramsci's theory? Now you have to keep in mind that Gramsci has many theories, right? Now these are not theories like theories in physics. Okay, so you remember from in the first class on literary theory, when I introduced literary theory and mentioned the types of literary theory to you, I also told you that theories in cultural studies, theories in humanities are not like theories in sciences, right? So distinction is often made between hard science and soft science, right? Hard science, now I'm again going back to some of the ideas I had already referred to in lecture 1, Introduction to Literary Theory. I'm referring to some of those ideas again, and I think those are necessary before we go on to specifically talk about Gramsci's theory. These things were not very necessary in Tagore's theories or Tagore's ideas on nationalism, because it is easier for us to, as Indians, to follow his ideas, because we are more familiar with the context, historical context, because many of the things you have already read in history while you were in school about Swadeshi, etc., etc. Anyway, that was a detour. Coming back to the concept of how literary theory or cultural theories are different from theories in sciences, you have to keep in mind that cultural studies is not exactly hard science, right? We often use the term soft science, and then there is the debate whether we should be using that term in the first place. But let me try to explain to you what that means, and then you can decide for yourself whether you want to use that term or want to use any other term. That's all right. So hard sciences are those disciplines, those subjects where nature is more easily predictable, right? Perhaps not easily predictable. Obviously, I cannot say it is easy to predict what physicists or biologists or chemists predict, right? I cannot say that. But the conclusions they draw are going to be very different in nature from the conclusions we draw while we study humanities, right? Our theories, our assumptions are based more on people, on society, and people and society, are very unpredictable, right? So naturally, you cannot call this a hard science. In like, think of a very simple theory in physics. I hope I am not, reducing ideas in physics. I hope I'm not, but I'm doing this just to get the point through to you. So, for example, take any of the theories in physics, like laws of Newton's laws of motion, or the laws of gravitation. All of these ideas. When I use the word hard science, I hope you are able to see that in all of these theories in physics, theories in the sciences, there is this idea of completeness, right? Like, there is this idea that everything can be predicted, or a lot of things can be predicted based on that law of motion or whatever else. But the same cannot be applied in humanities. The same simply cannot happen in humanities. You cannot absolutely predict human nature the way you can predict the motion of an object in space. I hope you are able to understand this. So this is the difference between hard science and soft science, and you need to keep that in mind while studying literature, obviously, and also more specifically while studying literary or cultural theory, right? Again, I'll repeat that example. When you look at the laws of motion, while we talk about the laws of motion, we can say quite definitively that a particle in space will move in a certain way. And how can we say that? We can say that on the basis of the theory that, say, Newton or Einstein or whoever else has provided us. But we cannot say the similar things with that much certainty, or with absolute certainty, that so and so will behave in a certain way in society. I hope now it's clearer to you, right? So with these in mind, let's go ahead and look at what Gramsci's ideas are, Gramsci's theories are. So Gramsci has already told you that each class produces its own intellectuals. Now, I had given the example of the billionaire intellectual and the intellectual of the working class. Just think of the example of Tocqueville and Marx and Gramsci on the other side, right? So while there are exceptions to the rule, generally Gramsci thinks that intellectuals try to protect the interest of the class they belong to. All right. So the capitalist class requires the neoliberal economist. Now, these are terms, neoliberal and all, these are terms you will hear a lot. I am not going to dive much into those terms today, right? Maybe if it is necessary in a later class, we'll do that. And but for today's class, I'm just going to give you the crust of the idea. All right. So the capitalist class, or who is the capitalist class? Capitalist class refers to the people who own resources. All right. So the working class are the people who work using those resources, and capitalist class are those who own those resources, right? So someone who owns the factory would be the capitalist in this paradigm, in this dynamic, and someone who works in the factory would be the working class. This is pretty simple, actually. So one is the owner, one is the worker. So in a neoliberal economist who is a specialist in political economy, and this is a quotation from Gramsci. If you remember, in the previous class, I had mentioned one of those quotations from Gramsci where he had said that the capitalist class, or every class, produces its own intellectuals, and the capitalist class has certain intellectuals such as the economist, the lawyer, even the professor, and so on and so forth, right? So these are people, they have created institutions so that their interests are protected. Understood? So basically, so that their message or their idea of life or the status quo is maintained, right? So that's very much the idea. Their idea is amplified. All right. Yeah. And the advertising executive, who in the previous quotation was the organizer of new culture. Similarly, the working class also has its own intellectuals. And who are the intellectuals of the working class? Now, let's take a pause here and once again look at the intellectuals of the capitalist class. Now, capitalist class, like I said, refer to the people who own, and these are people who just don't own resources. They have their own colleges, they have their own universities, they have malls, like they have an entire system of their own. An entire ecosystem would be a more accurate term. Now, within that ecosystem, all of their intellectuals, the intellectuals who they have created, right, such as professors of their institutions, lawyers who have passed from their institutions, right, advertising executives who work for them. It is not necessary that they have to pass from the institutions created by the capitalists, but it is necessary that all of these intellectuals protect the interests of the capitalist class, right? And that can be done legally, that can be done in a classroom, that can be done everywhere. So this is the larger message, right, that Gramsci is bringing to you, that it is possible to protect interests of a class not only in the parliament or not only in a street protest, right, and not only in through television or whatever, but it can be done through other means, such as simple as class teaching, such as advertising, such as making a film, right? So I'm actually kind of referring to another theory that Gramsci has here, which is something that derives from his understanding of intellectuals. So that theory is called the theory of hegemony. Hegemony. Now, the theory of hegemony is something you don't have in your syllabus, but I will mention it because it is something which Gramsci comes up with later somewhere in his prison notebooks, and the formation of that theory, the theory of hegemony, happens because of his ideation of his theory of intellectuals. So first he theorized intellectuals, and that theory led to further theorization, which led to the theory of hegemony. Okay, so few moments ago, the system that I referred to, wherein a class, any class, and more specifically the ruling class, will use all its institutions at its disposal to amplify its own interests, is called the theory of hegemony. All right. So, and to do that, it will be using all its resources, such as colleges at its disposal, universities at its disposal, the legal system if it is at its disposal, the advertising system, right, media, all of that, film, everything, TV series, web series, whatever. Okay, so maybe in a later class I will discuss the theory of hegemony if you are interested in, but well, not today. Let's go back to intellectuals, right? So on the one hand, the capitalist class has its own intellectuals. On the other hand, the working class also has its own intellectuals. Now the question is, who are the intellectuals of the working class? Now you can see this in two ways. One is an example provided here: farmers who understand crop disease and weather. Now see, there are hundreds, millions of farmers, right? Some farmers are better than others, right? It's not like all farmers produce the same thing, right? I do not know what your idea is of farming or whatever, what you know about agriculture, but I think it's not very difficult to believe that farmers are not all the same, right? And within farmers, within people who specialize in agriculture, there are people who understand crops better. There are people who can predict the weather better. There are people who can anticipate rain better, or there are people who can also anticipate the possibility that this year there may be an attack of locusts, right? I hope you're able to follow. For example, just when the lockdown began this year, there was an attack of locusts. Locusts are like insects. I'm not going to describe locusts anyway. So basically the point is, there are people who are able to predict these things. There are people who specialize in that knowledge, and these people are not necessarily those who have been to universities or colleges. These are organic intellectuals. Go back to the term. Who are organic intellectuals? Organic intellectuals are formed from within, right? These people have that naturalistic intelligence which they have gathered and accumulated and learned through experience to such an extent that they are able to do all of these things, to understand crop disease, to understand and predict weather, etc., etc. So these are the intellectuals of the working class. Now I have given you an example in farming. You can apply the same principle and think of examples in production of maybe mobile phones, maybe in production of anything for that matter, in a jute mill, anything. So practically in any occupation you can just apply this principle to the working class as well, and it is not very difficult to understand that working class can also have its own intellectuals. Now remember, from the previous class I mentioned that one of Gramsci's key observations is that these classes are in conflict. Why they are in conflict? Because what is in the interest of the working class? So that their salaries are raised, so that their wages increase, so that they get more bonuses, so that they have a better lifestyle, right? So that they are not exploited, right? So that child labor does not happen. All of these things. What is in the interest of the ruling class or the owner class? It is in the interest of the owner class to make more and more money, to keep the shareholders happy, etc., etc. See, it is important to note here that in this entire narrative, no one is the hero, no one is the villain. It is simply a system, right? And this is a system which Gramsci wants to change. All right. So again, do not look at this entire arrangement of intellectuals and different classes as people who are heroes and villains, right? This is not a film where the capitalist class is a villain, the factory owner is the villain, and hero is someone from the working class. We all know that story. Like it's in hundreds and hundreds of movies, right? Most of them rubbish movies. Anyway, the point is, do not look at this from a moralistic lens. You are intellectuals, you are studying a theory, and you need to try and look at it objectively, even if it is difficult. Even if Gramsci says that it is not possible to look at it objectively, you must try to. Anyway, each of these intellectuals project themselves as neutral, as beyond class, as objective scientists of reality. Now I have underlined this for you, and this is something I have also mentioned before. Now it is true that you, me, or anyone else for that matter, anyone pursuing higher studies or anyone engaged in any intellectual activity would like to think of himself or herself as neutral, right? Would I like to believe that I am a very biased person? Would I like to believe that I am biased towards a certain group of people and prejudiced against the other? Would I like to believe that? I would not. Would you like to believe that? You would not. That's pretty much what Gramsci is saying, that intellectuals, they think of themselves as objective, as beyond class, as not touched by class, as objective scientists of reality. Objective means not subjective, obviously. And if you remember, in I think I mentioned this in your class, could have been in a different class, but I'll mention this once again. So I usually use the example of something present in the classroom while talking about subjective and objective. I may have given the example of a fan or a cricket bat, right? These are like my go-to examples. Nevertheless, I will repeat this example just to explain to you what's the difference between objectivity and subjectivity, right? Now, okay, so think of anything for that matter. Let's think of something that many of us have seen, most of us have seen. Like, imagine your classroom and imagine the benches, right? Now, these benches have some objective qualities. What are objective qualities? Objective qualities are those qualities that we would all agree to. For example, if the bench is weighed and it is found that the bench weighs 2.5 kgs, I think it will be 2.5 kgs for me as well as for you. It's not like it will be 2.5 kgs for me and 3.7 kgs for you, right? That is objectivity, something which is common to all. Now, or something that is neutral. In this particular context, objectivity refers to neutrality. But what is subjective? Taking the same example, the same bench, you and I can have different opinions as to how comfortable the bench is, right? So while both of us can agree that the weight of the bench is the same, we may not agree as to how comfortable the bench is. To me, it may be a very comfortable bench. to you it may be an extremely uncomfortable bench, right? So this is a very basic example. I am being a bit reductive here, right? But yeah, I'm being, generalizing so that you understand. But remember, the terms subjective and objective are used in many more ways, right? And this is just one of the ways which I have tried to explain to you. But do read up on what objective and subjective means in other contexts, right? These are terms which are very, very crucial in philosophy, and anything that is crucial in philosophy is crucial to you, frankly, and you must make a note of it. So coming back to intellectuals and their relation with the idea of objectivity. So as an intellectual, I would like to think of myself as unbiased, unprejudiced, right? As someone beyond class, someone who is an objective scientist of reality. In other words, I like to think of myself as someone who sees the world as it is, right? But this is where the problem is. Gramsci will tell you, you are not seeing the world as it is. You are seeing the world as your class has taught you to see it, right? Now, I hope this is a sentence which is not very difficult to understand. Gramsci tells us that any intellectual, wherever he comes from, he may like to think, or she may like to think, that he or she is trying to interpret and understand social reality as it is. But he or she is in fact seeing it from the perspective or through the glasses or through the lenses. Remember, I referred to lenses in the introductory class, through the lenses which their own class has provided, right? Think of it. If two people are wearing two different two glasses, two spectacles which have different shades. Someone is wearing one which has a black shade, darker shade. Someone is wearing one which is, say, green. I don't know. So person A, who is wearing the grayer one, when he or she looks at the world, he sees the world as less bright, right? And when someone sees it through the greener lens, a lot of things which are not green appear a bit greenish. So that's pretty much it. So now take those glasses and think of those glasses as being provided by the class to which the intellectual belongs. All right, so that is pretty much the idea. No one is objective, right? Even if they are unaware of it, intellectuals are governed by their class position. Exactly. Again, the glass example. Now I give too many examples perhaps, but it is important that the point reaches you, right? So again, taking the glass example, someone with a dark glass with a darker shade, and then the one with a greenish shade, right? Now you may like to think that this is the glass which allows you to see the world objectively, but in reality that is a glass which has been provided to you by whoever has provided that to you, right? So in this case, whichever class you belong to. So they are governed by their class positions. The lens through which intellectuals see the world is not objective at all. So a certain view of the world that is shaped by the interests and needs of the capitalist class is what is exercised by intellectuals belonging to the capitalist class. All right, now now a very concrete examples. The examples I have given you so far are very hypothetical. Now let's look at some examples which Marx or Gramsci anticipate or mention in some form or the other. So intellectuals, for example, economists of the ruling governing class, insist that hunger in the world is a result of scarcity. Obviously, you are all familiar with the word scarcity. Basically means lack of something. In this case, lack of food. This economist, that is the economist who has come from the backdrop of the ruling class, may not like to acknowledge that the world produces 150% of its food requirements. So basically, if there are 100 people in the world, there is food for 150, but even then 25 people go hungry, maybe more than that. I hope you are able to follow. So this is a fact of our society. This is a fact of human life, that the world produces much more food than it actually needs to survive, than it actually needs to feed all the people in the world. But even then, despite producing so much more food, a lot of people, millions of people go hungry. Now Now, where does this class factor in, and where does intellectuals factor in this story? So, according to Gramsci, or if you take Gramsci's theory and apply to this fact, intellectuals who are from that background of the ruling or governing class, they will tell you that, or they will at least indicate that the fact that a lot of people go hungry is because there is a scarcity, there is a lack of food, but that in reality is not the case. Now, coming back to the peasantry, I've already mentioned the peasantry or the working class has its own intellectuals. There are farmers, like I said, who understand crop disease and weather, and these are farmers who are consulted by other farmers about mishaps on the field or for the advice about irrigation. These people are the intellectuals of the peasantry. Now, these intellectuals will tell you a different story. They will tell you, these farmers will tell you that we produce this much food, right? The worth of this food is a certain amount of money, but because of the people who control the market, we do not get paid for what we create, right? So you will see that there are varying perspectives based on your class position, and that's one of the central points to Gramsci's theory. Now, each intellectual, whatever your position in society is, each intellectual is organic to his or her class. Again, what is organic? Organic, that is something that has grown from within. So if I am from the peasantry, let's say I belong to the peasantry, let's say my parents are farmers, and I belong from that background, so I would be an intellectual who is organic to the peasantry, right? In other words, I have grown up in an environment that has made me look through a lens provided by the peasantry. Now, as opposed to, go back to the previous day's example, the billionaires and a son of a billionaire who goes on to become an economist. Now, again, do not look at this from a moralistic lens. It is not necessary that the son of a billionaire who becomes an economist cannot identify or cannot solve the problems of the working class. It's not like that. There is no hero villain here. Please look at it as objectively as you can. So the important point is that the billionaire, the person who has come from a billionaire background, looks at the world through a lens provided to him by his billionaire background, right? He is organic to that class. Now, these intellectuals, any of these intellectuals, Gramsci says, give, and this is a quote from Gramsci, homogeneity and awareness of its own function to their respective classes, right? So if I am an intellectual who stems from the peasantry, I am aware of the homogeneity and awareness of my function in my class, right? But again, it is possible for me to identify myself or commit myself to the interests of a different class. Okay, let me give you a very different example. This is not an example of class. This is an example of actually ethnicity, right? I will refer to two films. I'm hoping you will have watched any of these. If you haven't, please watch either. So there's a film from 1990 called Dances with Wolves, right? It's a very famous movie. It won every award at that time. So Dances with Wolves. Another film with a very similar story is the one that James Cameron made way back in 2009, Avatar. Alright, so what do these stories have in common? I'm hoping all of you have seen at least one of these. You're more likely to have seen Avatar though, but do watch Dances with Wolves if you haven't. So what is common to all these stories? So there is one person from one race or one planet in the case of Avatar, but let's forget the planet angle, let's look at it from a racial angle, right? So there's a person from one race who then finds company among another race, and this is a race which is, in this case, the oppressed race, and then there is the protagonist's original race, which is in this case mankind, human race, right? So he identifies and he commits to the cause of the race which is oppressed, right? So again, going back to what Gramsci says, it is possible for intellectuals to commit to the interests of other classes. All right, so I did not tell you the story of Dances with Wolves. It's very similar actually, but Dances with Wolves is actually based on real events, and it concerns the story of a white man who befriends and commits himself to the cause of red Indians who were oppressed, greatly oppressed and tortured and exploited by white men in America, white people in America in the 18th and 19th centuries. So please watch, these are great movies, you should definitely watch them. All right, so I think the point I was trying to make is clear to you, that intellectuals are organic to their own class. They derive and assume the interests of the class they belong to. They look at the world from the lens that their class has provided to them, but in some cases it is possible for intellectuals to commit and align to the interest of other classes. All right, now the last part of today's lecture, I'm calling this the problem with the existing intellectuals. Now this is, none of these are my ideas, by the way. Some of the examples are mine, but I'm discussing Gramsci's ideas with you. So again, Gramsci sees that intellectuals of the dominant classes, and this is a very important point, that intellectuals of the dominant classes are able to establish their views of social life as universal. Okay. This is a bit, perhaps it needs a little bit of unpacking. What do I mean when I say that dominant classes are able to establish their views of life as universal, right? So again, the dominant class by definition are the class who have much of the resources with them. Now what do I mean by resources? I do not mean natural gas and oil, right? I don't mean that. By resources, I mean universities, colleges, schools, legal institutions, right? Think of who are the representatives of the dominant classes in these institutions, right? Now, when you have your presence, I'm not trying to tell you that dominant classes control all these institutions. Do not bring that control angle here. I'm trying to tell you that dominant classes, since they own a lot of resources, they are able to bring their representatives, or they are able to establish their representatives in all of these institutions that I have referred to, whether it is the legal system, whether it is the educational system, whether it is the medical system, so on and so forth. Now, if you can dominate institutions, you can practically dictate what your views of life are to everyone else, right? So, for example, taking the hunger example, so let's take that example of hunger once again, and let's say that universities which have a great deal of representation of people from the elite class, people who are not from the working class, to be more specific, or in India we have this very common concept of middle class. I don't know, I don't have much to comment on that, but let's just take two classes in this example, the dominant class and the working class. All right, let's not bring in a third class here. This is very much for the purpose of understanding. You can bring that in, and that will add nuances, that will add more complications, but it will drive us away from our immediate objective here. All right, so the moment a class is able to place its representatives in a multitude of institutions, beginning from the legal system to the educational system to the health system, everything, even in sports perhaps, it is possible for them to portray their view of life as ideal, to portray their view of life as universal, as something everyone else should accept. All right, so let's say I belong to the dominant class, and I am someone who does not have a scarcity of food. Now, what will I do? I will create a law, or I will use my representatives in legal institutions to form a law where a person who may have had scarcity of food, but who is punished for, stealing food, right? Maybe there is this, I'll refer to a very different essay here. This is an essay in Bengali, but it's worth a read. It's called Beral, or The Cat. It's an essay by Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay. If you haven't read it, Please read it. Those of you who can read Bengali, please read it, and it is also available in English translation. So read the essay Beral, and I'm kind of making a point that Bankim Chandra made in that essay, that let's say hunger is a social reality, and someone steals food to feed his family or to feed himself. Now, is there any universal justification of punishing that person through our legal systems? Now, if you are in the dominant class, in the example I was giving you, I am in the dominant class, and I use my representatives in the legal systems to establish a law wherein anyone who steals food will be punished, will be sent to jail, irrespective of whether he was hungry, whether his family was dying out of hunger, and so on. So again, the larger point I'm trying to make, which Gramsci is trying to make, is that dominant classes are able to establish their views of life as universal, as something everyone else should follow. All right, take the example of hunger and try to understand this. They are able to conceal their class bias through their pretensions of social science. Again, social science, what we are doing here is social science. Literature by default may not be social science, but the direction in which we are taking it by way of discussing Gramsci here is social science. All right, so intellectuals of the dominant classes are able to conceal their class bias through the pretensions of social science. Again, go back to the example of the economist who would deny, who would say there is scarcity, while in reality there is no scarcity of food. They can establish categories and concepts that appear pure rather than congealed in the interests of the dominant class. So to protect my interests, I have created institutions. Those institutions are basically which are institutions that run society, right? Beginning from legal and educational, medical institutions. All right. So this is pretty much the point I tried to make today. So what Gramsci is effectively telling you is that intellectuals are not aware of their bias, but that bias exists in reality. While you may try to think of yourself as unbiased and unprejudiced, if you look back at yourself, if you don't get too ahead of yourself, right? If you pause and think about things in your life, if you pause and think about the ideas that you have, or the perceptions or projections of reality that are there in your mind, you will be able to notice that they are indeed shaded by, the lenses provided by your class, the class that you belong to, right? So that's very much Gramsci's idea. So again, who are the organic intellectuals? I will discuss that in even greater detail soon in the next classes. But again, just a brief, moment on who are the organic intellectuals and who are the non-organic intellectuals. Organic intellectuals are those people who have come out from within their class, right? To whom intellectual activity was not induced from outside, right? So again, take that example of a farmer, an experienced farmer who is aware of crops, who knows what diseases can happen at what time of day, and what, like, not what type of day, what time of the year, what insects may attack plants, what pesticides to use, etc., etc. So those are intellectuals who have learned through experience, and whose experience and intellect is also referred to by other people of their class. Similarly, there are organic intellectuals in the dominant classes as well, and what is common to many of these organic intellectuals is that they try to protect the interests of their own classes while believing that they are objective. So this is a fallacy, right? It is simply not possible. And Gramsci's point is exactly that the absence of bias simply doesn't exist. In other words, like, put it in very simple terms, prejudice is real and it exists in intellectuals, right? On that note, I'm ending today's class. The next class will have even further discussions on organic and the other kind, traditional intellectuals, right? And also a bit on the third kind of intellectual that Gramsci projects. All right, so we'll end here.